Hello YouTube, this is Neon. The title of today's talk is going to be false confessions. And I'm talking about false police confessions during interrogations. So, I just finished watching an episode of Forensic Files, and it was about a boat that had crashed in a storm. It didn't crash, but it ultimately was sunk as a result of this storm it had gotten caught in the Gulf of Mexico. In the Gulf of Mexico, just outside of Louisiana. The captain of the boat died. His assistant survived by floating for 12 hours and was rescued. Now, by another boat. The captain was found 5 days later. His foot had been caught in a net on the boat as the boat went down, so he drowned. Ultimately, his body did come loose, and he was found by another boat 5 days later. One of his boots was missing as a result of him getting caught in this netting. So his assistant, who survived, he had a low IQ, and he was heralded as a hero because he tried to save the captain, but it just didn't happen. When the body of the captain was found, there was a lot of damage to the body, and the detectives basically, well, first of all, the coroner, who did not do a good job at all, ruled it as a homicide. It was not a homicide. He in fact had been run over by boats, but these wounds that were on him, which were post-mortem, were assumed to be defensive wounds and attack wounds. They in fact were not. So they interrogated this poor guy, his assistant, for 8 hours straight. They intimidated him, they yelled at him, they said things like, "You did it, we know you did it, tell us how you did it." Very, very aggressive. This guy was a small guy, low IQ, and these big detectives are doing this. They invaded his space. Like literally, they're this close to him, yelling at him. And this interrogation went on for 8 hours. It went on for 5 hours one day, and then it went on for 3 hours another day. He said no 100 times, and many times he said very emphatically, no. But many times detectives, they just lie. And it's legal during interrogations for them just to lie. In many states, it's legal for them to say, "We have evidence that you did this, somebody told us you did this, we have eyewitnesses that say you did this." The reason is that because confessions come above all else. They come above all evidence, unfortunately. And to most jurors, if a person admitted to doing a crime, then they did the crime. And if they didn't do the crime, why on earth would they admit to it? And the police, in my opinion, they don't want to do paperwork. They don't want to do the investigative work. They don't want to do the investigative work that's necessary to find out what happened. In this case, there was no crime. The boat captain who found the body of this other captain said that he knew immediately that this guy had been run over by boats. They just didn't see him, and that's where those wounds came from. They had fished him out, I believe. And the captain, this captain had been a boat captain for many years, probably decades, and he said this wasn't his first time finding a body. That people die occasionally, and in the Gulf of Mexico, and he's found bodies before, and he said he's seen this before. But they want to get a confession rather than wanting to get the truth. Why? Because they want to get a conviction. They want to minimize probably the amount of paperwork, the amount of investigative work that they have to do. Imagine if you're being nagged and yelled at and accused, and your space is being invaded, and you have people trying to intimidate you for 8 hours. Eventually you'll admit to it just to get them off your back. Many times, which is another lie that detectives commonly use, is you just tell us what, essentially you tell us what we want to hear, and then you can go home. And once they confess to it, now they're going to go to jail and then prison. They may not say tell us what we want to hear, but tell us what we know you did already, which is equivalent to tell us what we want to hear. But that wouldn't make them look good, so they don't use that wording. These practices really need to change. Now, one of the boats that hit him in the head post-mortem, and it looked like he might have been struck with something. And this poor guy, he just wants to get them off their back. So he winds up telling them the version that they came up with, which involved him being hit over the head. And the poor guy, he says, I hit him with a board, and they knew this particular fishing board didn't have any, fishing boat didn't have any boards on it. I hit him with a hammer, they knew it didn't have hammer. So eventually he says, well, I hit him with a pipe. This poor guy is literally trying to get them off his friggin' back. They had another guy, a very professional and elite coroner, look at the crime scene photos, and it was clear to him that the cuts were from a motorboat, that the cuts did not penetrate. They were trying to say that these were defensive wounds to his arm where he had been stabbed, and in fact it was the propeller of a boat that went over him. And the cuts were very superficial and didn't go deep, and they were not knife wounds. But the original coroner, who was just not qualified and did not do a decent job, for whatever reason, assumed it was a homicide. It was not. There was another case of a false confession where a 14-year-old boy was forced, essentially, to confess that he murdered his, I think his little sister, who was 12 years old. They wound up finding the murderer of his sister, who ended up being a gentleman who was homeless and had severe mental illness. He broke into these people's home. He murdered this little 12-year-old girl. As I understand it, there is no evidence of sexual abuse, but he did brutally, bloody, in a bloody manner, murder this young girl. Curiously enough, he was wearing a red sweater that had her blood on the sweater, but you really couldn't tell because it was almost a blood red color, the sweater itself. When they found him, thank God, her blood was all over his body, all over his sweater, particularly parts of his sweater had been drenched. And it was clear that this gentleman, who was mentally ill and homeless, had murdered this little angel, this lamb. But using the tactics that I said, and by the way, also illegally interrogating this young man. I do not remember what state he was in. But at 14, they should not have been interrogating him without the parents being present and without notifying the parents beforehand. They did neither. They use a lot of these brutal tactics that many professionals, particularly those who wound up getting this poor man who did not murder his captain, they wound up getting him an innocent, the jury found him innocent, okay? Thank God. But while the presumably prosecution just wanted to play the part of the interrogation that, thankfully to God, the whole 8 hours was recorded, the part of the interrogation that said, where he confessed, the defense was able to get the entire 8 hours played. And basically all of the jurors said, if I had been badgered for 8 hours and bullied this way, I probably would have confessed too, just to get them away from spitting in my face. So fortunately he did. He is a free man, thank God. So they did the same thing to this 14-year-old boy who broke down and confessed to something that he didn't do. Psychologically traumatized this young man. they were interviewing this young man during a radio broadcast, and one of the detectives called in, and the woman in charge, or the woman, I don't know what you call them, the DJ, the radio personality, who was doing this interview of this young man, she allowed for this detective to chime in. She kind of told him off. He deserved to be told off, he and his cohorts, for what they did. Cohorts is a strong word, but he and the other detectives who did not do a good, decent, humane, human, legal job during this interrogation. He seemed to have no regrets for what he did. As I said, the woman who was on the radio station had some pretty choice and strong words for him. Interrogation should be about getting to the truth, not about getting someone to confess. Okay? Not about getting someone to confess. Many times when suspects repeat the detective's versions of what they supposedly did in committing a crime, many times their confession doesn't coincide with many of the physical facts of with many of the physical facts, or with the physical evidence of the case. But all they want is that confession. So I would say, thank God, there's things like DNA now, there's things like fingerprints, there's forensic psychologists, there's other powerful tools in law enforcement that can overrule false confessions. Or the evidence is so powerful that clearly somebody confessed to a crime that they did not commit because they were bullied and intimidated into doing so after 8 hours or 10 hours or days. And the last thing that I wanted to say about false confessions is that false confessions happen all over the world. There was one guy who confessed to raping and murdering a young woman, and now they do believe that because he lived in that area, it's very possible that he had come across her body, got scared, and took off, because he did know one or two things related to, I guess, how her body had been positioned. And this happened in the UK, and he confessed, and I think he got life in prison or something. And ultimately, she had been killed by a serial killer, and they were able to prove that he had nothing to do with it because his DNA was not on this little lambs, which is what I'm choosing to call these angels, men and women who get killed. But there was none of his DNA on her body, so he was freed. But these false confessions happen all over the world. So hopefully an end can be put to this. Hopefully more states will require that the interrogations have to be recorded and filmed from beginning to end. And hopefully there'll be more of an emphasis on getting the truth versus getting a confession. And hopefully more, I don't even remember the terminology, but the forensic coroners, I guess, that they'll be held accountable and called to task and be trained better so that we don't have people falsely imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. Many times people who are falsely imprisoned are there because of a false confession, because they were bullied and intimidated into confessing to something that they did not commit. While we may be inclined to think, I would never admit to it no matter what they did, if you saw what they're subject to, you probably would confess as well after being subjected to this kind of police brutality, which is what many professionals are now calling this. So if you like this video, please like, subscribe, share, comment commercials, recommend my videos, do one of those things. Thank you. Best wishes.